behind the scenes, you have these banking and investment movers and shakers trying to push the fourth industrial revolution ideas into play. And you also have another large group of green philanthropists. In the United States, the House Judiciary Committee is now looking into what they call the climate cartel on the basis of antitrust violations. And Mark Carney's GFANZ, which is the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, is right in their target as an antitrust violation. So this is where we see some of the major financial institutes in the States, they're now backing away from the net zero thing because of these antitrust accusations.
Michelle Stirling, it is so good to see you again. I am so happy we're talking again. You are one of my all-time favorite guests. You pull no punches. You are the scrappiest, toughest lady out there screaming against the climate change hoax. Yeah. So how are you doing? How have you been?
Thanks. Good.
Good.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah. Thank God COP is over and it was a flop. So, we see the house of cards of climate coming down slowly, but it's coming down.
Yeah. And, that was actually what I was going to lead with, because, it seems like this climate change discussion has left, the mainstream consciousness. But here we are in Canada, and Justin Trudeau and his gang of dipshits just keep pushing forward with this thing, and they're adamant about it, even though it seems like all of the other Western nations are starting to distance themselves from ESGs and SDGs and so on and so forth. Justin Trudeau is just plowing forward. Why are they doing that?
Well, it's hard to know what exactly is going on behind the scenes. I think there are a few things that people are not aware of. Canada did sign the Cooperation and Economic Trade Arrangement or Agreement or something like that, CETA, with Europe, which probably requires us to comply in some respects with some of the things they're doing there. And you can see that like in agricultural policy. They have a policy in Europe, I think it's called Farm to Fork, where they're reducing agricultural emissions and basically just shutting down farmers. And that's why we see all those big farmer protests there. But we have a very similar policy here. So a lot of the things that are happening in Europe are mirrored here or echoed here in a very unusual way, because it seems like it's foreign influence, if you like. And also Canada, when Trump was last elected, Canada entered into a climate and culture agreement with France that was barely reported in the media. We did a video about it. But the whole purpose of it was to push carbon taxes and carbon trade and climate policy. Meanwhile, our largest neighbor to the south, had gone completely the opposite direction. We're in that situation again now. So I don't know how long-standing that particular arrangement is with France, but that's definitely a push. And so you might say, well, why? Why would we bother with that? Well, if you look at the Laurentian elite and the biggest companies in Quebec, say Bombardier, McCain Foods, any of these big companies, they sort of started in Canada, but they really are global and international, transnational companies. And a lot of them are situated in France because they're French speaking. And so, or in China, that's another place. But they therefore must comply with this rule that comes out of France. What's it called? Article 237 or something to that effect. And it requires all investees to take a certain climate and carbon position worldwide. And that came into force around 2016, 2017, shortly after the Paris Agreement. So, this had long tentacles that reached into many companies operating in countries where there was no carbon tax and where climate wasn't a big thing. And I don't think that that's very much discussed in the media. Don't think many people have explored it at all. We've explored it a bit. Now, the other thing that people don't realize, there's a body called the United Nations Principles for Responsible Investment, UNPRI. And it is a signatory body of over 1,000 different kinds of pension funds and institutional investors, endowment funds, and various things like that. So climate change is their goal in life. This is all about what they are. And their financial fiduciary guru is Al Gore. So you know where that's going to go. And also, they sit on about $121 trillion in assets under management. And in 2014, in Montreal, they had a big conference and they came up with the Montreal Pledge. And a number of different institutional investors signed on to that. One of them was NEI Investments of Canada, which is made up of the Credit Unions of Canada and Desjardins out of Quebec. So what it did is that these institutional investors committed to working over corporations and governments that were deemed to be climate laggards to try and force them into compliance. And one of the first hits that they had for NEI investments was the Notley government in Alberta. So if you wonder where the climate plan in Alberta came from under the Notley government, look no further than NEI investments. And we have a whole open letter on our blog that has the attachments of the letters that were sent to Rachel Notley saying, hi, we're glad you're interested in climate. We represent 120 of the attached signatories, and we have about $4 trillion invested. I think it said in Alberta, actually. And basically, it's kind of an extortion scheme because they say, look, we've got all these investments, and if you don't comply, they don't say that outright, but that's definitely the feeling. And then they say, here's what we think you should do. Like coal phase out was one of the top items on their list. And so we did early coal phase out. So I've kind of babbled a lot there. Could I just go on about the coal phase out issue?
Yeah, please, Michelle, please.
Okay, if you remember last winter when the polar vortex hit, we almost went to blackout in Alberta. So, a lot of people say, oh, well, coal phase out is irrelevant. It's already done. What happened in early coal phase out is that the newest plants under the federal legislation were going to be able to operate until 2060. The oldest plants would all be offline by 2030. So there was already a plan to shut down the oldest coal plants in Alberta. But under the Notley government, all the coal plants were shut down, including the newest. And I think Keep Hills had come online maybe only in 2007. So, it had a useful life of another generation or more. Yeah. So the thing is that coal is very cheap. We have lots of it in Alberta. We had about 7,000 people working in the coal industry at the time. And so that early shutdown took away the cheapest, most reliable form of power generation for Alberta. And it also took away the option of us sending excess coal-fired power to British Columbia at night when we didn't need it, so that they could tamp down their reservoirs and their hydropower and restore the water in their dams. And that's something that we had done in the past, but we can't do that anymore because we don't have that excess power. And if you look at BC, what have they been suffering from? Drought, right? Yeah. So anyway, there are lots of implications of this activist investor, NEI Investments, that caused billions of dollars in losses for Albertans and payments that we have to make, compensation payments. I think we're paying TransAlta something like $37 million a year for 12 years in compensation for closing down the coal plants. And that's a valid compensation. Like that was in their contract, and it's also in World Bank contracts regarding public private partnerships, that if there's a change in legislation, and that's what the carbon tax did. It made operating a coal plant unaffordable. It made it a liability instead of a profit center. If there's a change like that, then the corporation has to be compensated. So um, so I guess what I'm saying is that there's all these influences that no one's really aware of. They're very big. They're usually very financial in nature. They're tied to the banking industry, to the pension fund industry, and they're forcing decisions on the public that the public never voted for.
And might I add that most of the public isn't even aware of.
Right, and also government officials. I can remember I was at some kind of event in Calgary, and it was even before Jason Kenney was elected, and so they had a question and answer thing. So I put up my hand and I said, what do you think of the influence of the UNPRI? And there's another body called the Carbon Disclosure Project, which is a Rockefeller project. And, I outlined a bit of who they were and what they were doing. He'd never heard of them, and he'd been a federal public official, an MP, and working in all kinds of international affairs. But I don't think that he was kidding. He looked completely blank. And I asked a few other people in the room after at coffee time. Only one person I knew had heard of them, but didn't really know much about the influence.
And basically the way that they're operating, at least in the way that you've explained it, it seems like it's just large scale global mafia style extortion, right?
Well, the thing is that they are transnational. They're unelected, they're unaccountable, and they are transnational, and they sit on this huge amount of assets under management. And so now this is also where the DEI stuff comes from. So, if you're a university and your pension fund is signatory or part of a mutual fund that's signatory to the UNPRI, then you have to comply with these DEI goofy things, because that's part of the signatory agreement that people must comply or explain. So it starts off as an innocent thing. I mean, I'm sure we would all want our pension funds to be investing in responsible development. But it's ironic. For instance, Canada Pension Plan is invested in coal. Where? In China, right? So Alberta coal workers' pensions that are in the pension plan are invested in coal in China, which is the largest emitter in the world. And as you started this conversation about Justin Trudeau's push for capping oil and gas emissions, China is the largest emitter in the world. It emits in 1 month what Canada emits in a year and 8 months. So no matter what we do, it's completely inconsequential. And yet our pension plan is invested there in coal. It's crazy.
Yeah.
Totally crazy.
And so how feasible would it be for, say, companies that are facing this type of extortion to pull the pension funds from these managers, to say, okay, that's it, we're pulling, we're done? Like, are they even capable of doing something like that?
Well, I don't really know, because I don't understand enough of that sort of high level corporate stuff. But I would say, for instance, if you remember under the Notley regime, all of a sudden big companies like Suncor said, yes, we're going to build a whole bunch of solar farms and wind farms, because we think that's a fantastic idea. We're going to save the planet. I suspect that these kind of big investors like NEI Investment probably sit in the boardroom and say, look, we think you should build a bunch of solar and wind farms. And the CEO probably says something like, look, it's not our core business. We'd like to concentrate on what we do well, and we don't see any particular advantage to it. And they say, well, we can find another CEO. And he says, you know what? It's a great idea. Why don't we do that? There's not a lot of jobs for CEOs. The
Yeah.
cost of putting up a wind farm is nominal compared to, the billions of dollars that oil and gas companies invest in development of their resources. So, a wind farm is, I don't know, $100 million. Okay, fine. Here's the check, take it and run. And then, of course, they get carbon trading credits with the wind farm. They look green. They get capital cost allowance. I think 30% now on all kind of green stuff. So, the government has contrived a number of incentives and benefits. And of course, we, the taxpayer, are the ones underwriting that. And by building these wind and solar farms, we also end up underwriting additional transmission lines and distribution lines and infrastructure. And I think, for instance, at the Alberta Electric System Operator, they had to install a new forecasting program or computer or equipment for the anticipated 30% wind and solar on the grid. It was my understanding at the time that this was in the 9 figures. So this is a hidden cost to consumers that, we don't even know about. But that's why your electricity bills keep going up, because of all these. You go, oh, look, wind and solar are free. Sure, but not the backup, not the distribution lines, not the extra transmission lines, not the integration, because wind and solar are direct current power, whereas the grid is alternative current. So you have to have an integration system to make sure that the electricity generated can be used on the grid. So all these little things all add up. They're so
It just seems so counterintuitive, right? It
except,
seems.
these investors, the activist investors, likely are either directly or indirectly invested in all these things, like the wind farms, the solar farms, the transmission lines, like into AltaLink, into the gas pipelines, because we know that there's going to have to be gas backup. So, they capitalize on every sector. But again, a big chunk of that is drained from ordinary citizens. And the federal government has contrived so many different regulations against affordable, reliable power and for the unreliable, expensive power. That these companies are cornered, the CEOs are cornered, because you can't just say, no, I'm not going to do it. Either you lose your job or your investors say, you know what, we'll go and invest in somebody who will.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I want to pivot to Justin Trudeau's oil and gas cap. But
Mm-hmm.
really quickly, I want to ask you this. And we've covered this before in the past, but I really think it's important for people to understand this. So, you have these giant corporations that are extorting, government and corporation, public-private partnerships that are basically using extortion as a method to force these companies to capitulate to these green initiatives. So what is their motivation, and who's over top of them? Who's extorting them? Because it seems like there's got to be something a layer above that's directing all of this, right? There has to be something above all of it that's causing it to move in that direction, right?
Well, I think I would look at the Bank for International Settlements and the central banking industry. In 2015, which was in the lead up to the Paris Agreement, Mark Carney he was then the governor of the Bank of England, and he made a presentation to Lloyd's of London, which is the largest insurance company in the world. And in it, he called it the tragedy of the horizon, suggesting that the problem with climate change is that, we are too short-term thinkers. We're not looking down the road 20, 30 years when all the climate catastrophe will hit. So we have to act now. The problem is that he was relying on a report that was written by 2 green billionaires and a bevy of NGOs. Those billionaires were Michael Bloomberg and Tom Steyer. And Roger Pielke Jr. reported on this in Forbes. So you can find it under something like how to Green Billionaires Corrupted Science, I think it's called, something to that effect. Anyway, why was it corrupted? Well, because, and I'll pull out my favorite chart, because, and I just happen to have it here, they used what's called RCP 8.5, which is this on the graph here. This is
Yeah.
an extreme climate scenario. Now, these scenarios were developed just for lab research, just for trying to figure out what actually drives climate change. So RCP 8.5 is an implausible scenario because the people who developed it put in the fact that there would be more coal burned on Earth than there is on Earth, that the population would be 3 to 6 billion times more than what the UN even predicts, that more oil would be used than could even be found by that time using present known methods and known resources. So it's a completely implausible scenario. But they use this as the business as usual scenario. And this has become embedded in the financial institutions of Canada and the world. The Bank of International Settlements still uses it. The Bank of Canada, the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions, which oversees all of these pension funds and institutional investors and financial institutions in Canada and the banks, they use it as the business as usual. And so they are now requiring all these corporations and banks to do climate reporting based on that scenario. They have another one that they use as well, the 4.5. But in fact, Roger, which is not catastrophic, by the way, Roger PLK Jr. says that the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change points out that we're already below the 4.5 in terms of emissions. But people still think we're up here. So in the financial industry, they think that we're going into a catastrophe when the reality is that we're not even near a catastrophe.
Right.
But these guys are locked into it. And you can see why, because climate change has become a $1.5 trillion annual industry in the world.
Right.
And lots of people are invested in things that they want to see take off. And most of them have been misled by either the financiers or by some of these investment houses, like when we look at Northvolt going bankrupt after we threw billions of dollars at it. I just saw a tweet the other day, I can find it for you, but it said that Goldman Sachs had predicted that it would be like a fabulously rewarding company, right? And who did Mark Carney used to work for?
Right.
Goldman Sachs, right?
Right.
So behind the scenes, you have these banking and investment movers and shakers trying to push the fourth industrial revolution ideas into play. And you also have another large group of green philanthropists. In the United States, the House Judiciary Committee is now looking into what they call the climate cartel on the basis of antitrust violations. And Mark Carney's GFANZ, which is the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, is right in their target as an antitrust violation. So this is where we see some of the major financial institutes in the States, they're now backing away from the net zero thing because of these antitrust accusations. In Canada, that's not happening. We see the opposite, where big green philanthropies here, like the Trottier Family Foundation, they are actively funding almost all of the big ENGOs here, and for quite a bit of money. And they're pushing the climate mantras, and that includes the emissions cap. And in fact, one of the groups they funded is called CANRAC, Canadian Climate Action Network of Canada, and RAC is for the French version. And CANRAC came out with this document paving the way to
For an
an
equitable
equitable
future.
future.
Yeah.
And one of the things they're promoting is an emissions cap. And actually, at COP28 last year, Trottier was handing out emissions caps, literally a cap like you're wearing. So I just did a video recently on the delusions cap, that we should be capping the delusions of these maniacs like Canrock, because they're making like outrageous suggestions, and yet they're very, very influential. This is an organization of over 150 various environmental groups in Canada, and they're networked internationally. So they're all playing the same tune, but they have dozens and dozens of lobbyists who are in and out of ministerial offices in Ottawa every day or on the phone with them. Um, and you, the citizen, you don't have that. You think and hope that your elected MP is going to go to Ottawa and speak up on your behalf, on behalf of your industry, but they're completely outnumbered by these guys who have not only lots of registered lobbyists, but they also have unions in here as well. They also have thousands of foot soldiers. So, when David Suzuki puts out a call for, we want 10,000 people to sign this point and click email petition to your MP to endorse the emissions cap, well, they'll probably get that 10,000 in, a couple of hours. And, then David Suzuki might do some little sob story video about how necessary it is. Meanwhile, you, the ordinary citizen, you're busy driving to work, taking the kids to daycare or soccer, whatever. And you don't have this money and influence that these guys have.
Yeah. And so, it's always struck me, and this is the case for well over 100 years, right? With the term equity, because equity, it sounds nice, right? We're going to bring everybody together, put everybody on the same platform. There's going to be nobody who has an advantage over the other. But what you like that document that you held up, paving the way for an equitable future, what they're forgetting to mention is that equity in the terms in which it's being presented doesn't mean we're all going to live free and happy. It means that we're all going to live poor and destitute and starve and in starvation. The equity they're talking about is severe poverty for all, right?
Right. And they're giving away your money. Like they want here to, just let me find it. Oh, they also like to denigrate Canada. They claim here that Canada is the world's biggest polluter, among the world's biggest polluters, and one of the biggest producers of fossil fuels. The biggest producer of fossil fuels is the United States of America. And Canada is number 4, but we're way behind them. So Canada and the US are the only 2 free nations in the world with large oil and gas supplies. And yet all these guys want to limit our production. And you have to ask, they either have these pecuniary interests in investments in wind and solar, as I pointed out, or in carbon markets, or there's some foreign influence there. And I know you've done lots of work with Sam Cooper, and I think that that's a very good question to ask, if through some backdoor way we're being our product is being kept off the world market to the benefit of our competitor nations, and those competitor nations are the ones funding these crazy groups who enforce these policies.
I'm going to actually talk to Sam about that, because I think that this would be, I've always had the sense that all of this stuff that we're seeing is coming from somewhere else, because it mirrors things that have occurred in other countries at other periods in history almost perfectly, right? And specifically China. And so it just seems like the tactics, these aren't new tactics that they're using. These are old tactics and strategies. It's just that as a civilization, specifically or particularly Western civilization, we have a very short memory, and people don't have a knowledge of history beyond 10 or 15 or even 20 years ago. And so they're able to get away with this stuff because people en masse can't identify it. And then the people that do, people like myself, yourself, others like James Lindsay, they're all of a sudden become the conspiracy theory crazies because, we recognize what's happening. We see it, we point it out, and everybody's like, come on, man, you're a conspiracy theorist. But now here we are, slowly sliding into oblivion. And, everybody can't figure out why that's happening, while people like us have been telling them for a long time exactly why it's happening. Now, I want to ask, Justin Trudeau put a cap on oil and gas,
Mm-hmm.
or at least announced his cap on oil and gas production on November 5th, right? Which was America's election day. And it
Right.
seemed to me like he was trying to signal that his government was going to be in line with who they thought was going to win that election, who just so happened to not win. And
Mm-hmm.
it went completely the opposite direction. Now, I want to ask you, what is the reason for this cap on oil and gas production? I mean, we know that the climate change thing is his purported reasoning behind putting a cap on Canadian oil and gas production. But what is the real reason? What is the real driver behind it? And is this CanRac group involved in his decision to do something so drastic and just, economically devastating?
Well, first of all, I want to clarify one point, and there's also a video with Jonathan Wilkinson and Stephen Guilbeault sitting side by side in chairs. And the point that they make is that this is not a cap on production, it's a cap on emissions. So that's true. The point is that it's impossible to meet those emissions targets in a very short period of time as what's allowed. So effectively, it is a cap on production. Now, yes, this group has advocated for it for a long time. All the associated groups here have advocated for it. The Trottier Family Foundation at COP28, as I said, came out with the emissions cap. Sephora Berman, one of the best known Canadian anti-oil and gas activists, has developed this fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty where she and her sponsors don't want any more infrastructure or any more exploration because in their view, we should be winding down and transitioning to a green economy. If you look at our world in data and see the transition that supposedly is happening, it's not happening. For the past 30 years, we've been spending trillions of dollars on wind and solar, and yet the world still uses 81% fossil fuels as the primary source of energy. So that hasn't changed over 30 years. Every COP conference, the emissions go up. So why are they picking on little old Canada? Well, I would say, first of all, I think there's a lot of naive people in the front of this. A lot of young people, a lot of the climate activists, I think they are true believers and they honestly do want to change the world and have an energy transition. They just know nothing about how energy systems work. So they're being exploited. Then I think that there are these layers of, the green philanthropists, the UNPRI signatories, who are manipulating markets and trying to create new markets, hoping to replace existing working markets with something as a new market that would make them a larger margin of profit. So, post-war, there was like a huge boom in all kinds of new things. Lots of new technologies came out of World War II. And suddenly the world was free to develop these things. We were no longer at war. And so all that war machine turned into the commercial development, especially in North America. But by sort of the I'd say late 70s, mid 80s, a lot of that had cooled. The profit margins were not so great. And the public pension demands and the pension demands in unions were growing, but the pension funds were not. And in 1970, Peter Drucker foresaw that soon unions would own most of corporate America. He called it pension fund socialism. And that is what's happened. Um, but the problem is they were not making enough money to support the pension liabilities. So it seems like some bright boys, probably at McKinsey, decided to come up with, hey, why don't we make all new things for all the things that made us money after the war? So instead of regular cars, we'll make EVs, and we'll make that the new way, and we'll make a lot of money doing that, just as we did post-war. Um, and they did this kind of fourth industrial revolution thinking without actually thinking it through. Um, for instance, they didn't do an assessment of the material supply chain necessary for this. Well, it doesn't exist. So uh, there is no net zero material supply chain. But people
Right.
like CANRAC and Trottier Family Foundation, don't know that or don't want to talk about it. There's a video called The Tipping Point, End of the Oil Sands that CBC did in 2011. And in it, they interviewed Vinod Khosla, who is a big Silicon Valley entrepreneur. And at the time, he was invested in a company called Amyris, which was supposedly making biofuels in a lab from yeast. So you could see this like automatic picker picking up little spots of yeast and popping them into some kind of cooker. And then you see a guy with, like a big beaker. And so he's running around with this beaker, and it's big as a beaker, but it's nothing compared to the scale of gasoline consumed in the United States in one day, right? But
Yeah.
Khosla thought, look, if I can replace that gasoline with this lab-made biofuel, like I'll be a billionaire. Well, he's already a billionaire, I think, but he thought he'd be, okay, a trillionaire. But, the scale up totally killed it. So within about a year from that documentary, he was, Amyris had gone bankrupt. I think they're making biofuel in Brazil, maybe from sugarcane or something. So I think I lost the point of your question. Sorry.
Oh no, just sorry. Yeah, I know. There's just so much to cover here. We're talking about Trudeau's cap on oil and
Right.
gas emissions. So let's get into brass tacks here. What is their proposed, like? What is their how much are they proposing to cut, like, immediately? I believe
Well,
it's something like 30%, right?
Well, according to a report that Robert Lyman did for us, which he called it a dire assessment, and it's based on the Deloitte report. And he said that Deloitte estimates that meeting the cap obligations through production curtailment would mean reducing total Canadian oil production by 626,000 barrels per day, or about 10% compared to the production in 2030 under business as usual. Most of this reduction, 526,000 barrels per day, would be in Alberta. So that's why it's a big deal for us, because even though it's a Canadian law, it basically hammers Alberta. Canada would also have to reduce natural gas production by about 2.2 billion cubic feet per day, which is equivalent to a 12% reduction in production under business as usual in 2030. And he goes on to say, if production is curtailed, as Deloitte projects, GDP in Alberta's oil and gas sector would be 16.2 billion, or 20% lower compared to the baseline in 2040. And in the rest of Canada, the GDP in the sector is projected to be 2.7 billion lower by 2040 compared to the baseline. So that's from Robert Lyman's report.
And so essentially, like, to kind of summarize this would be, I mean, we're talking doomsday level economic collapse, right? Like, I mean, that's really where we're going here.
Well, we'd still have an industry, but at some point you say, well, the whole point of industry is to be more efficient and have more production with more value produced from the production. Why would you go backward and limit production and limit income. Like, you still have the facilities where you could produce more. Why would you produce less,
Yeah.
to save the planet when China is not going to do that?
Right. And we're essentially handing those keys over to countries like China and Saudi Arabia and Qatar and the United States, saying, here, make up for what we're not going to produce, right?
That's right. Yeah. So, it's hard to know if there's some influence at the level of international banking. Are they playing the puppeteer behind the scenes where certain countries will get certain benefits? Is it at a corporate level? Um, is it all these climate activists? Again, some of these huge philanthropies have unbelievable amounts of money, and they
Mm-hmm.
don't have any shareholders to answer to. And if you look at in the States in the 1950s, they did a report called the Reese Commission. And in it, they looked at company or organizations, foundations
Yeah.
like Rockefeller and Carnegie and the other big foundations. And they found that they had incredible influence, and the US government really had no tools to stop them doing whatever the heck they wanted to. Now, these foundations were set up with good intent that, when a wealthy person passed away, then the foundation would not have the death tax or not have the death tax rate that other people would have, but on condition that they contributed in a constructive way to the community. For instance, building hospital facilities, schools. I mean, look, even in Calgary, we have the Carnegie Library in
Right.
Calgary. We
Mm-hmm.
have one down there in Central Park. So those were all positive things. But of course, over time, they've become very politicized, and they all jumped into this climate change bandwagon wholeheartedly. So you
Yeah.
have these billions of dollars that are swaying the conversation. Now, perhaps they have investments, let's say, in Saudi oil. We don't know. I don't know. Maybe they do. Uh, so it would be to their benefit to limit Alberta. The other angle, you mentioned China again. China has a stated mandate that it wants to be the world's manufacturer of all high-tech equipment by 2025, which is a month and a half away. So if
Mm-hmm.
you look at what's happening in the UK and in Germany, for instance, both of which used to produce very high quality, specific sort of industrial equipment, they're both going in the dumper. Especially Germany used to produce lots of beautiful cars, BMW, Porsche, etc. Well, that's falling apart, and China is going to take that market. That Germany's economy is collapsing, and who's going to be a winner? Well, China.
Yeah.
So, to some extent, the US is also benefiting because a lot of industries are moving to the US because there's lots of affordable, reliable energy there. But China is definitely a winner. China also has a plan to be the world's dominant power by 2049, which is 1 year
Yeah.
away from 2050, which is a net zero target. So you have to wonder, does net zero actually mean like no production, no manufacturing in the rest of the world, and
Mm-hmm.
China will rule the world and make everything?
Well, I've talked to a number of different military intelligence people, and what they believe is that this is all being driven by China, that all of this is coming from China, and that China has significant influence over these giant multinational globalist organizations like the World Economic Forum, for example, but there's tons of them. I mean, the WEF is just the most well known because Klaus Schwab is, fits the perfect role of villain. But another thing I want to remind listeners is that, Germany's economy is collapsing because they invested, I mean, they put all their chips on going green, and now they're realizing that that was a complete and total fantasy. They are finding themselves in the exact same position that they were after the First World War, which led to the rise of Hitler. So if you want to talk about Hitler, and you want to refer to Trump as Hitler, which is the most insane thing I've ever heard, Trump politically is more liberal than Obama, and I'll fight anybody who wants to have that discussion with me. But if you want to talk about the rise of Hitler, you are creating the conditions. We are creating the conditions through this ideological stupidity and green initiatives that will give way to the rise of an authoritarian leader or regime, right? And
Mm-hmm.
that's essentially what we're doing, is we're creating those conditions. And Germany is a precursor to where Canada is going, right? Like, do you see the connection there as well?
Yes, I do. Yeah, and we just did a video, and Robert Lyman did a report, which was based on. There were two reports that came out of Europe. One was the Marco Draghi report, which he did for the European Union on competitiveness, and then the Clintel Network published a report by Professor Samuel Fafari, and Fafari is a geopolitical energy expert. And so he had a look at the Draghi report and was very, very critical of it, of course, because on the one hand, Draghi was saying, look, we have to be more competitive. And then he'd say, and let's go green. So, I think part of what's happened here, and so Robert summarized the Fafari report into a smaller plain language report. It's on our blog. But what I think has probably happened is that a lot of pension funds in countries invested in China, and now China has this lever that it can lean on any country, because their funds are tied up there. It's my understanding that once you invest in China, you can't get your money back out. You may be able to get some margin of profit, but it's not like you can withdraw your money. You see, and I think we have a blog post about the infrastructure bank, which we wrote in 2017. And at the time, Larry Fink was saying that most of these pension funds need to make a margin of profit of 7.7% every year, and they'd been running at about 4%. Now, around that time and before, China was said to be growing at 8%. So it looked like a real growth market. And I think a lot of companies and countries and institutional investors and pension funds put their money there. Sorry, my cat is here.
No, it's all good. He can join us.
Yeah. And hoping to get a big win. And they didn't get a big win, and now they're all stuck there. So, and probably no one wants to confess this to their public. Again, this is all speculation on my part, but that's the only reason I can see why people are going along with these totally destructive policies. Well, that and the banks, like I said, the Bank for International Settlements. And, literally handing this prize to China. And of course, there's another thing that people are not talking about. There's a rare metals war going on in the world. One of it we see in Ukraine, because that area is full of all kinds of rare metals. So that's a big part of the underlying reason for that conflict there. The other place that has tons of rare minerals or critical minerals is Canada. So Canada keeps saying now, yes, we're going to develop all these minerals, and we're going to cut oil and gas production, and we're going to cut emissions. Well, mining takes 10% of the world's energy. So
Right.
there are a few instances where you can run a mine off electricity. But in general, you have these big honking diesel trucks that are consuming like 2 million gallons of diesel a year. These big diggers and crushers. So, if we can't cut oil and gas emissions and oil and gas production if we want to develop critical minerals, but who wants to have access to those critical minerals? Well, China does, because it needs them to meet its goal of being the Made in China 2025 world's manufacturer of high tech. So you can see that behind the scenes, a lot of the things that are limiting production or export or development of these industries in Canada will ultimately play into the hands of China. For instance, just recently, I think it was the Haisla First Nation on the coast is planning to negotiate directly with China to get their LNG there. Now, to my mind, that's China sitting back and going, haha, it's playing out exactly as we wanted. And I guess, according to news reports, CSIS has said to them, like, hey, this is a very risky endeavor you're going into. Like, even though obviously this First Nation wants to make an international deal and make money, all good, all entrepreneurial, but these are international negotiations and they're very, very tricky. So, who's going to
Yeah.
win?
So me and Sam Cooper have discussed this
Mm-hmm.
in the past, and yeah, this one is really scary because you have technically sovereign, Indian tribes, First Nations in Canada, who I guess kind of, it's a bit murky, but can technically and legally uh, come up with these international trade agreements, right? Because they themselves are considered a sovereign nation under Canadian law. However, this is a massive security risk for our country at large.
Mm-hmm.
And China is very, very good at manipulating these people into doing what they want them to do.
Mm-hmm.
And so China has kind of found a way around the Canadian government to get their hands on what they want, because a lot of this LNG and oil and other minerals is underneath Indian land, essentially, right?
That's right. Yeah, if you look at the map of critical minerals, it's all adjacent to or on tribal lands. And if you look at what happened with this is kind of a diversion, but I think it's related. If you look at what happened, the Kamloops band claimed in 2021 that they had found human remains and mass graves of 215 children. This past year, they changed that and said that they were reflecting on the anomalies that had been found. No more mass graves, right? So, uh, at that time, the negotiations over the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People, that legislation, had been stalled in Canada because 6 provinces and several First Nations had been opposed to it or had wanted clarification of the terms. But it wasn't going anywhere, partly because of COVID and partly because the Liberal government just wanted to push it through as was. So 1 month from the date of the claim of mass graves and dead children, UNDRIP received royal assent. So it's like from that point, no one had any objections. We were suddenly a genocidal nation. We were a horrible criminal organization. We'd done, nefarious things. And the day after UNDRIP was passed, it could be a coincidence, but the day after, China accused Canada of genocide and used the Kamloops find as the basis of evidence. So what UNDRIP does is that it does elevate First Nations communities to sort of a nation-to-nation negotiation, and it has given several of them ideas or opportunities to be like literally their own nation. So, for instance, the Haida Gwaii in BC, the Haida Gwaii Islands were handed back to the Haida Nation, probably unconstitutionally, by the BC government because BC as a province has adopted DRIPA, which is a provincial version of UNDRIP. And that's how they implemented that. So, that's caused a lot of consternation in British Columbia because British Columbia does not have the treaty structure that most of the rest of Canada has. There were virtually no treaties signed in BC. There are some modern treaties, but so what does that mean? It means that these resource-rich areas of Canada, become subject to, as you pointed out, foreign activity that may have security risks, that isn't part of the sovereign government, that probably would not be part of Canada's taxation and revenue system. And there's 630 First Nations in Canada. So I think more than 630. So, we're basically balkanizing Canada under the UNDRIP legislation, or we're
Yeah.
opening a door to that. And again, I hope that Indigenous groups and communities can have economic development, but you have to look at it realistically. Some of the largest communities in Canada of First Nations are maybe 12,000 people.
Yes. Thank
You
you.
know, so you don't have the human resource structure to run a big industry out of 12,000 people. Most of them are 500 people or less.
Yes.
So
And
you could have an Indigenous led project, meaning that one or two people from that community become the representative, but it's not like you're going to get that First Nation operating, say, an oil sands mine, because they just don't have the people. If you have a 500 person population in a community, you probably don't have a mining engineer or a senior CFA, financial accountant, and all the kinds of people that you would need to do that. They simply don't exist. So what will happen? Not only will these groups like or countries like China be able to capitalize on this, but so will groups like Deloitte. You know, all the big consulting firms, they love this because, you know, they'll come in and run it for you.
yeah,
Right? But
yeah,
Canada won't benefit from it, and probably most of the people on the reserve or at that First Nation will not benefit either.
will not
The
benefit
elite
either.
will. They'll
Yes.
they'll skim the cream, but the
Yes.
regular people will still be living 15 people to a broken down house and
Yeah.
wondering what hit them.
Yeah. So I say this as a Métis person.
Mhm.
Okay. I say this as somebody who is, of Indian ancestry. These communities do not have the beginnings of the capabilities to negotiate international trade agreements with a country like China that will manipulate and will take advantage in everywhere that they see vulnerabilities. Right? You're talking about a toddler negotiating with a hedge fund manager,
Right.
right? Like
Exactly right.
it's and not only that, but through that back door, China gains access to all sorts of sensitive, high risk information that they wouldn't have otherwise had access to. Right. Well, at least I want to believe they didn't. I don't know with this Trudeau government exactly what they have access to, but China essentially has a backdoor into Canada through these Indian bans, and that's why. So you just blew my mind because essentially that's what they did was they pushed the child grave hoax, which it was. There was never any graves found. Right. This was all based on hearsay amongst what they call oral tradition, but what rational people call rumors. And so through pushing that child graves hoax, they essentially played a political game to put these sovereign nations on at the same level, right? Equity with
Hmm.
the Canadian government. And through that, essentially said, well, if these are sovereign nations, we should be able to deal with them directly without any red tape from Canadian bureaucrats, right? Which again, at this point in time, I'm not even confident that the people who should be involved in these processes are smart enough, competent enough, or honest enough to be involved. But essentially they should be. But through pushing the child graves hoax, UNDRIP goes through, and here we are now with, like you said, communities of 500 people negotiating with a behemoth like China for
Hmm.
oil and gas, right? And
Right.
minerals.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, and UNDRIP is also rewriting all of the laws of Canada to align with UNDRIP.
Yeah.
And other places like Australia and New Zealand rejected UNDRIP. But and Canada did for a long time too. There were some principles that made sense to look at or to adopt, but not all of them. And unfortunately, now we've adopted all of them. And it's very interesting that the Kamloops band in the fall, after their claimed find, they posted an open letter in the Globe and Mail, and in it, they were not saying, we want people to grieve with us over our find. In fact, they were demanding from the Trudeau government that they should have the full right of tax collection over their sovereign territory and all kinds of things that had nothing to do with
Yeah.
these allegedly deceased children. You'd think that if there were actually graves there, that would be your first priority. But this was all about sovereignty and tax collection and tariffs and such like. And if
Right.
you want to see, this format has actually been around for a long time. If people look at what's her name? Oh, it skips my mind for a minute. She wrote A Cloak of Green. Oh, Elaine Dewar. She wrote it back in the 1990s. And she was talking about how surprised she was when she went to this Amazon rainforest night and found that there was a funny mix of like corporations and big corporations and ENGOs running around promoting this. And what was happening is exactly what we've described, is that because of this kind of activism, these corporations had found a way to make direct deals with various tribes in the Amazon. And, of course, because there's such small communities, there are no regulations for the environment. There were, it's just rape and pillage, basically. So it's a known template. It's not something
Yeah.
new.
And so for all you idiots out there walking around in orange shirts, plastered with "Every Child Matters," that orange shirt should be red and it should say "Only China Matters," because that's all that matters here in that context. So
That's very funny you should mention that shirt, because I think, and I'm working on this, I think that we should have shirts that say every living child matters most of all.
I love it, because you know what? That is the message that we need to be sending. And that's a much deeper conversation, but that's exactly the way I feel. Is why are we walking around remembering the ghosts of children who didn't exist? Right? Those children
Right.
existed, but they're not in those graves. They weren't. There is, for people listening, there have been no bodies discovered in any of these supposed grave sites. None. Zero. They haven't found anything.
Yeah.
So we're walking around remembering imaginary ghosts. Meanwhile, we have children in these communities who are alive, who are malnourished, who don't have running water in their homes, who grow up in households where their parents are addicted to drugs or well, drugs and alcohol, are being emotionally, sexually, and physically abused. But fuck them.
Yeah.
Let's just wear orange shirts and remember a bunch of pretend ghosts that don't exist.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And you
Because
can
it's
see
easier
that
that
there's
way.
also big money behind that movement too. And again, I think that this is, you see, if you feel guilty about something, then you won't defend it, right? If you feel that your country or your ancestors did something wrong,
Right.
then
Right.
if someone says, well, these people should have the right to land back or to operating their own mine with China or whatever, then you probably go, you know what? You're right. We did so many bad, horrible things. Here, take it, please. I'm sorry, So
Yeah.
it's part of a much larger campaign of wresting the sovereignty of Canada from the hands of Canadians, and all these people, pushing the oil and gas cap. As I said, they're probably well-meaning, well-intentioned climate activists, and they have no idea, and they don't realize, like, we are sitting on a basket of riches in Canada, not just the critical
Yeah.
minerals, the forests, the fresh water, the oil and gas. We've got everything here, and we're willing to just let go of it or give it away, because the tar sands campaign has denigrated Canadians. The recent claims of mass graves and genocide has denigrated Canadians. The burning of churches, the toppling of statues, the destroying of our historical roots or denigrating of our historical roots has made it much easier for these outside forces to then say, oh, well, then maybe we should take over for you,
Right.
because obviously you're not good stewards and you're not decent people.
Yeah. And just to clarify something for people listening, I have family members who went through the residential school system. I'm not saying that it was I'm not saying that those residential schools didn't exist. And I'm not saying that there wasn't just unprecedented abuse in those schools. What I am saying is that by creating these mass graves hoaxes, like what Michelle just explained, what we're doing is we're creating a whole litany of other problems. And by just going along with pretending that those mass graves existed and bodies were found, we are digging ourselves a hole deeper than we even know. And it's just all done through niceties and being polite and just being too afraid to say, well, what the fuck are we wearing these orange shirts for? Because did we even find any kids? Right. And this leads to something much bigger and much darker for all of us. Right.
Right. And I think it's important to realize that a lot of the children who went to these schools were orphaned. And
Yeah.
so, of course, if you're an orphan, that means your caregiver or family member, parents died. And so you were probably swept away from a recent death and burial scene. And perhaps if your family member had tuberculosis, which was a plague at the time, a global plague up until the 1950s or so, they might have died a horrible death right in front of you. If they went into a coughing fit, there would be blood everywhere, because you're basically the tubercles in the lungs would pop. You know, they'd be full of blood and pus, and then you'd go into this coughing fit, which there'd be like rivers of blood spewing. So let's assume that a child is orphaned in that way and then ends up in this suddenly new, strange, very structured place that they didn't expect to be there. That would be very disconcerting. Of course, there would be stories of graves um, and catastrophic death deeply imprinted on them. And of course, in a school setting with children telling tales to each other and ghost stories, these things would develop. Beyond that, though, it should be noted that probably about 2/3 of the students were actually enrolled by their parents. And they were enrolled according to the denomination of the parents. You know, there's this whole theory that children were taken away, forced to go to the school, and indoctrinated in Christianity when their parents were already Catholics. They were already
Christians. Yeah.
Anglicans and had been for decades in the
That's
family.
right.
So, but again, you know, it's this debasement of our historical facts that is leading to these other issues where our resource industries are able to be crushed by these activists and the silly laws that Ottawa is implementing. And, you know, I mentioned before we started the show about getting to net zero. Can I just go there now?
Of course, yeah, please. But I just want to cap off
Okay.
that part of the discussion by saying this. You know, we have thousands of Indigenous women who have disappeared into thin air over the last 30 or 40 years. Many bodies found in ravines, in ditches, stuffed underneath a single room occupancy hotel beds in the Lower East Side of Vancouver. Nobody has bothered to look into what happened to them, and if they were never discovered, to look for them, period. Okay, that's a real problem we have in this country. Indigenous women are viewed as throwaway people. And so if we're going to get angry about a bunch of children who never existed, why aren't we angry about these young girls and women who have disappeared into thin air?
Yeah.
Who are real. They're
Yes.
real.
Yeah.
Right? And that hypocrisy drives me nuts. So I want to pose that to the listeners. Why don't we care about them? Why are they throwaway people? And that's it. That's all I had to say. Michelle, please, let's pivot.
Well, I agree with you. I agree with you 100% on that.
Yeah.
And that's like an ongoing tragedy. But if we're talking now, we'll switch to getting to net zero.
Yeah.
And this cap on emissions. One of our directors, Ian Cameron, did an analysis of the Canada Energy Regulator plans to get to net zero. And so it's amazing to see how completely illogical they are. They have plans that that hydrogen would easily take over, that costs would decline for CCUS, that heat pump costs would decline 15% by 2030 and 40% by 2050, and everybody would have one in their home. And building shells, it would be very easy to improve the efficiency of 80% of the buildings by 2050. Carbon capture and storage would range from $45 to $200 per ton CO2 by 2030, and 30 to 160, that's a pretty big range, per ton CO2 by 2030 to 2050. And that hydrogen would take over, and aluminum production would be easy to make, and blah, 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 blah. So, and that we'd plant lots of trees, and that we'd also use what's called BECCS, which is where you plant switchgrass, then you harvest and burn it, and you do that in a plant that has carbon capture facilities, and this is considered a net zero way to make electricity. But of course, the scale of agriculture needed to do that would remove a large part of food production from Canada. So, you know, why don't we just use oil, gas, and coal and
Yeah.
make our energy that way? But there's a graph that I will send you, and this graph shows that it is really impossible to meet net zero by 2030, by 2050, by 20, even further out, 2100. It's impossible because energy is used by everyone for everything. And there's a comparison report that Ian Cameron looked at. And Ian's an engineer by training, by the way. And the comparison report was done by the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, which is a very left-wing organization. But their report was far more realistic and brutal. And theirs is called Getting to Net Zero in Canada, Scale of the Problem, Government Projections, and Daunting Challenges. So you can find references to these on our website, on our blog, Getting to Net Zero. So here's some of the points that the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives came up with. They say that, to summarize, the requirements of the Canada Energy Regulator scenarios imply that massive changes are needed in Canada's energy system. End-use energy demand must be reduced by 33 to 41% on a per capita basis. That means you and me have to cut our energy demand by 33 to 41%, and by 15 to 25% on an overall basis. To reach net zero by 2050 in the Canada Energy Regulator's net zero scenarios, oil production must be cut 21 to 75%. Gas production must be cut 37 to 68%. Wind and solar generation must increase 10 to 12 times. Biomass geothermal generation must increase 6 to 7 times. Nuclear generation must nearly triple, and carbon capture, utilization, and storage must increase 34 to 39 times. And direct air capture must increase by 4,600 to 5,500 times of current world capacity. So these are completely ridiculous notions. This is impossible to meet, not to mention, as I said earlier, if you're making things like wind and solar, you have to mine minerals, and mining takes up 10% of the world's energy. And then you have to manufacture, so you need energy for that too. And transport, you need energy. So you can't triple or quadruple or 10 to 12 times increase wind and solar generation without also increasing oil, gas, and coal production.
So
it's
now
ludicrous.
it is. And you know, like, you're reading out these numbers, and I think for most people, like, we hear those numbers and we think, okay, it's like you said, the the numbers are ludicrous, right? Like you're talking
Mhm.
10, 12, 14 times, 35 times, we have to decrease by 70+%.
Yeah.
But but from like a real world perspective, what does that mean for us, right? Like you're talking about 10% of the world's 10% of our energy required in order to mine the minerals, in order to build the renewable energy product. You know what I mean? Like we could look at a scenario where we burn ourselves out just trying to build the stuff required in order to meet those ludicrous numbers, right? Like
Mhm.
you're talking 10% of our energy just to mine the minerals to build these solar panels and windmills and so on, and and other pie in the sky ideas. And then we have to increase our capacity by like 30, 40, 50 times. Like it like what you're saying is absolutely true. It's impossible. It cannot happen.
Mhm.
But if we were to attempt it, I mean, we could look at potentially collapsing not just our economy but our civilization overall, just in attempting to build this stuff, right?
Yes, and that's actually always been one of my personal concerns is that, because there's such a strong ideological thrust behind the climate movement, that it's very likely that we can get enough people on board to agree to go along with a lot of it. And the evidence of that is just the EV buses in Calgary, for instance. Why
Hmm.
is Calgary buying EV buses when we know they were a total failure in Edmonton?
Yeah.
Excuse me, and the EV bus factory is going bankrupt, but they're still going ahead with it. So, that obviously there's enough ideological alignment that people think this is a good idea. But my concern has always been that we will get far enough down the road where suddenly we realize we don't have the energy or resources to complete this mission, and we also don't have the money or resources to go back.
Right.
We've broken so many things, we can't go back, we can't fix it.
And so that's the concern, right? Is that we're so driven by this. I mean, let's just be honest, this cult ideology, right?
Mhm.
To try to achieve something that is virtually impossible, that will kill ourselves on the road there. Like we're not even gonna get to the halfway point before we realize we fucked up to such a catastrophic degree we can't go back and we can't go forward. Now we're just stuck in this wasteland where we've pulled everything out of the ground in an effort to not pull anything out of the ground anymore.
And imagine Western society in that situation, and China sitting pretty without having ever tried to do any of that stupid stuff. And they want to be world dominant by 2049. Well, hello, we just handed everything over because we'll have this crippled society and crippled civilization and industry, and they will be in charge.
That's right. And we'll have no choice but to capitulate, right? Because
Yes.
how are we going to feed ourselves? How are we going to grow food? How are we, like the thing that always kind of stuns me is how people who allow this radical ideology to think for them never really question, like, okay, well, where does the energy come from then? Do
Hmm.
we even have the resources to do this? Do we even have the intelligence to accomplish this? Like, it's like whenever I listen to Justin Trudeau talk about climate change, I mean, he talks about it in a way that's so crude and rudimentary and basic that it's like it's clear he doesn't even really grasp the general concepts of what he's talking about, right?
Hmm.
He's fed his talking points, which again, I think for listeners, if you've been listening to this show long enough, you really need to look into the people around him and who's behind those people, because it seems like a lot of those people are linked to the same people who are trying to push us toward net zero, which
Hmm.
seems like a virtuous cause on the surface. But once you talk to people like Michelle Stirling and read the stuff that's available on the Friends of Science website or Friends of Science X account, you realize that this is actually really a death cult.
Hmm.
Essentially, like this is pushing humanity, or at least Western civilization, toward extinction.
Yes, and there's a very good report by Dr. Simon Michaud, which he did for the Geological Survey of Finland. And he's got a number of videos online as well where he goes through his report because it's kind of heavy. But for instance, like he's a mining engineer, and he said he'd been in all kinds of meetings where people were cheering on net zero. But as a mining engineer, he'd always wondered, do people understand the supply chain of minerals for this? So he himself sat down, and for the Geological Survey of Finland, he did a kind of a mathematical analysis on a fairly basic level where he took the minerals mined in 2019 and he extrapolated the numbers out to the alleged minerals and materials needed for the 2030-2050 goals. And for instance, just to mine the copper would take 189 years. So we're going to miss both those goals. Just to mine the lithium would take 7,000 plus years. So once you see his statistics, you just go, wow, how did this ever get past anyone's desk? You mean
Right.
all these people? You mean people like Mark Carney? You
Yeah.
mean people like Michael Bloomberg? You mean people like Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and all the leaders of the world? What's his name? Keir Starmer in the UK and Olaf Scholz in Germany. You mean nobody ever said, is there a material supply chain for these big ideas? No one ever requested that because it looks like no one ever did. But if they had done, 20 years ago, they would have said, wait, we're putting the brakes on all of this. We'll keep trying to improve our efficiency. We'll keep trying to come up with innovations like small nuclear, small modular reactors, but we're not going down this net zero road because, as you say, it's suicide.
So I want to ask you this question. What's more plausible? Okay. That these numbers that yourself and the experts have been able to put together just doing simple math, just by, doing simple data analysis, things that, a dummy like me could do. Mm-hmm. And that none of these powerful billionaires and government figures ever thought to put those numbers together or have anybody put the numbers together or never even saw them? Or is it more plausible that they're working for somebody who's not us?
Who's not what?
Who's not us? The people that the people they're supposed to be working for.
Well, it could be, but I think I think it's really that there was a fellow named and is a fellow. I think he's still alive. Jeremy Rifkin. I usually have his book laying around here. He wrote a number of books. One is called The Hydrogen Economy, and another one he wrote is called Zero Marginal Society, I think it is. And he also wrote another book called The Third Industrial Revolution. He's an economist and a futurist, but what he wrote was very compelling. And the Zero Marginal Society book was translated in 36 different languages. He gave dozens and dozens of presentations in corporations and government offices. And he states, actually, there's a very funny kind of, I think it's 2014 article in HuffPost, where he's talking about how he's fabulously redesigned the energy plan for Germany. And how in 2020 they're going to be leaping ahead of the United States, and of course everything is completely falling apart there. And I think Germany is a very ideological kind of nation, and once they glom onto an idea, they just don't give up, and that's what happened. They took his advice. And of course, these are high-paid consultants. I'd also probably throw McKinsey in there too, because McKinsey earned a huge amount of money through Enron. They were part of Enron, which blew up in a case of bad accounting back in 2001. Mm-hmm. But the whole green scheme has actually been born out of the death of Enron and risen like a phoenix with the notion of this global carbon trading plan, which actually was just passed at the last COP29. But my point is that these guys were making money off this stuff at the time, and they all had this strong ideological bent, and they were dangling visions of greener world and lots of money and a world with zero marginal cost. That's what it's called, and people fell for it.
Well,
And I just
it's
think
that old.
because he was very popular. His book was published in 36 different languages. He was
Yeah.
directing the energy policies of great nations like Germany. Like, why wouldn't other people get on board? And it's really hard for people in these public positions to have paid a fortune to a consultant and then years down the road say, you know what? We were misled.
Mm.
They're not going to do it.
Yeah.
They're just going to keep driving away. They're still trying to make a hydrogen miracle in the world, and it's not going to happen. So, but nobody
Well,
wants
it's
to stand up and say we made a mistake.
yeah. Well, it's in like I mean in Germany's situation, I think that they are trying to distance themselves from their past as much as humanly possible, and I think that's why they're susceptible to radical
Yes.
left wing ideas, right? But it's I just I look at all this, right, and I listen to you. I think honestly, you're the most informed person I've ever encountered. Michelle, one of these days, I want to do a 4-hour mega episode with you because you're just like you're a mine of information. I
Wow.
think we need 20% of our energy to mine the information that's in your head. But it's the more I listen to you, the more I'm just blown away by how this could all happen and how people like you are out there, and this, and you're a spokesperson for a group of people. So there's more than just you. You're not, Michelle Stirling in some cabin in the woods writing your manifesto, right? Like there's a lot of people who are aware of what's happening, but it's been so buried and so obscured that we don't even have access to the beginning of what to the preface of the book that you could write. We don't have even the beginnings of it, and that's for a reason. That information is being obfuscated and muddied for a reason, right? And that's the part that really freaks me out, is because like even when you're talking, I'm able to grasp most of it, but some of it, and I know you're still just brushing the surface. Some of it is so convoluted. It's hard to wrap your mind around, right? And so here we are, right? Like we're in this situation where, like you said, we are on the road to doing something that we are not as human beings capable of doing, right? Like I want to ask you 2 final questions before we go. And Michelle, I'm going to have you back like right away, because I want to take out 3 or 4 hours of our time and just let you talk, because I think the things that you're saying are so important. And we haven't spoken in like a year, and you're reminding me of things that we've talked about before that I'm like, holy shit, yeah, that's right. But I just want to talk about oil and gas here for a second. So I want to ask 2 questions. I'll ask the first, and then I'll ask the second one after. If we were to reduce production of oil and gas by 20%, what sort of impact would that have on Canada, not just economically, but also just our ability to, say, turn on the lights? What in your view, what sort of impact would that have on us?
Well, it would depend on the province, first of all, because Canada, ironically, has a very clean electricity grid. And so most of the generation in Canada, power generation, is hydro. A lot in Ontario is nuclear. But Alberta, it's mostly natural gas. And the problem would be both with natural gas heating for homes and for natural gas power generation backup. Like in Ontario, they have lots of wind there, but it's not very substantial performer except when they're exporting that power. They also have natural gas there, which was put in to ramp up and down for the wind and solar that they have there. But in fact, what ends up happening is that Quebec ends up drawing power from Ontario, if you can believe it, in winter, because Quebec has electrified most of the homes in Montreal. So they've gone off natural gas, they've gone off wood heating and oil heating. But in peak winter time, they need more energy, so they draw the natural gas power from Ontario. So um, in Alberta, we operate mostly on natural gas, and we've added more natural gas plants, and there are more coming online, which is good, except the federal government, in their clean energy, clean electricity regulations, they want to criminalize people who build and operate natural gas plants after, I think it's 2030 or 2035. So just like they threatened to throw Premier Scott Moe of Saskatchewan in jail for operating coal plants, and we sometimes draw on Saskatchewan's coal plants to keep our lights on, they want to throw him in jail for coal, and they would throw Alberta operators of natural gas in jail for natural gas. So if we cut the production of natural gas, that will affect home heating in most provinces. It will affect power generation definitely in Alberta. It may affect as well power generation in winter peak times in Quebec and Ontario. And I don't have those kind of comparisons off the top in other provinces, except I think in BC, I think is about 69% home heated by natural gas. And everyone has these visions of, oh, we'll just put in heat pumps, it'll all be fine. On the lower mainland in BC, I think you can manage with a heat pump in winter and maybe a space heater here and there, which they may make space heaters illegal too, because they draw a lot of electrical power. But the rest of this country, how are we going to heat our homes? And they've also made wood burning fireplaces illegal in many places as well, because of course burning wood is a very large emitter. So, this is going, and for industry, industry requires the heat of natural gas to make many things, the thermal heat, but they also require natural gas as a product stream, because most plastics and many chemical components are made from natural gas. So it would damage those industries as well. So what are we doing? And would we then just import them from other places? Why would we do that? Because there's a carbon footprint for that boat and wherever they're made. This is a lunacy.
Okay. And final question, Michelle, I'm dead serious. We're going to do a mega episode, a 4-hour long, because I just want to download everything into one show. Final question. So here in Canada, the legacy media is running around, like a chicken with its head cut off, freaked out over Trump's incoming tariffs on Canadian exports. The newly elected Trump and his administration have identified Canada's border as a security threat, rightfully so, because we have massive gaps along our border where people are just walking back and forth, right?
Yeah.
And, Trudeau, of course, brought in his cap on oil and gas emissions or production, however you want to view it. And essentially, at least in my view, I wrote about this a few weeks ago, but it seems like he's cut our country off at the knees, because Canadian oil and gas is a very important bargaining chip in our trade negotiations with the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And now we've put ourselves in a position where we don't really have much to bargain with here. And we are looking at tariffs on our exports into the United States, which they are by far and away our biggest trade partner, without question.
Yes.
Up to 40 times the size of anyone else that's buying Canadian goods. So just, you can answer this one quickly, but in your perspective, what role does Canadian oil and gas play in our relationship with the United States? And what does this new cap on oil and gas production do to our ability to negotiate with the United States when it comes to trade?
Well, it's a big problem, because I think that Premier Smith has rightly so identified that there is an energy gap in the world, and that even though the United States is rolling in oil and gas, they don't have any shortage down there. Energy security is a necessary requirement in today's world, which is fraught with geopolitical conflicts and rising threats of even worse geopolitical conflicts. So, whether it be the risk of hybrid warfare, where domestically certain production facilities are hit either by eco-terrorists like the people who follow Andreas Malm, who wrote the book How to Blow Up a Pipeline, or whether it's hit by hybrid warfare of various nations who are antagonistic toward the United States or Canada. If we can be mutually assured of providing supply, whether it be by train, by truck, pipeline, whatever it may be, if we know that we have a strong energy security in North America between our two countries, that would go a long way to improving national security for both countries. And making sure also that we have access to fertilizer for agriculture and food security. So that was a point I forgot to mention in the reduction of natural gas. We need natural gas to make anhydrous ammonia and fertilizer. We need it. And without that, billions of people in the world will starve because our food production will drop dramatically. So I think this cap, is probably the most destructive thing for Canada, definitely for Alberta. And as you point out, it's a real barrier to the concept of energy security with the United States. Like, who wants to partner with a country that is actively cutting their own production? Like, why would you do that? Like, what will you have to sell the States if we're cutting our own production? Anyway, so I think I probably have blabbed enough.
No, not nearly enough, Michelle. I feel like I didn't shut up enough today. I feel like I said way too much in our conversation. Danielle Smith is going to Trump's inauguration in January, which I think signals to us that we're moving in a different direction than the federal Trudeau government, which is strange because now we have a very fractured and divided country thanks to Justin Trudeau's radical perspective. Or I wouldn't even call it a perspective. Whatever puppet strings are pulling on him, right? And now we're looking at a situation where that Danielle Smith is going to try to kickstart that Keystone XL pipeline again with Trump.
Mhm.
But what does that mean for us? How are we even able to bring in the investment to do it? Because we have a federal government that's going to try to get in the way of it at every turn, right? And what does that mean for Alberta as a province? What does that mean for the western provinces of Canada, specifically Alberta and Saskatchewan? What does that mean going forward? Will Canada even exist?
Well,
Right? Like that. These are all real questions.
yeah, on that note, I would, as maybe my end comment, I'd like to suggest that your viewers look at our blog item from May 10th of 2017 called Can Canada Survive Climate Change Policy? And there's also a video on our YouTube channel with Robert Lyman giving this presentation. And at that time, he was quite optimistic that we could, even though he felt that the climate change policy could actually divide Canada and blow Canada apart. But he was optimistic that we would find a way through it and, come to our senses. But at the time, he had suggested that achieving the aspirational goal of an 80% reduction in emissions recommended by the IPCC would mean reducing emissions to 147 megatons CO2 equivalent. That would be comparable to reducing Canada's per capita emissions and our energy economy to the current levels of Bolivia, Sudan, or Iraq. So if you want to live that way, that's where these policies are leading us. And I think that you're quite right. It's really blowing Canada apart. And maybe that ultimately will be a good thing, actually.
I
I'd
think
like
so
to say
too.
it, but
Yeah. But what else can we do? Right? Like it's almost a matter of survival at this point.
mhm.
Michelle, so I am going to be doing a mega episode with Sam Cooper. We're going to do the history of China, China's influence in Canada,
Oh, great.
and all of the wild things that go on there and the dark shadows. And I would like to do a Christmas Stirling New Year's climate change special. And
Thank you.
if you're up for it, I would love to do this again. And I want to walk through the history of the climate change hoax with you, because I think this is something that people need to be aware of. How would you feel about that?
Okay, yeah, sounds great. Just give me
It's
a bit
probably
of
gonna.
advance notice so I can prepare.
I will. It'll be about a 3 or 4 hour conversation. So, listeners, you guys can look forward to that. Michelle Stirling is the baddest ass lady on the planet. I love everything you do. I still keep up with everything that's going on with Friends of Science. And Michelle, I feel honored that you give me your time to talk to me. You're such a wonderful speaker. And sorry I interjected so much in this conversation. You got me all electrified, with liquid gas. I was just ready to go. Um, Michelle, before we wrap it up, can you tell everybody where they can find you?
Sure. So, Friends of Science is online at friendsofscience.org. You can see us on YouTube. We're on LinkedIn. We're on Twitter, of course, X, very active there. Also, Facebook. We're on Instagram and Gab and Odyssey. And I think that's it. But, we do invite people to engage with us. We advocate for open civil debate on climate and energy policies and full cost benefit analysis before policies are implemented. So if you're down for that, then join us. You can become a member of Friends of Science. Then you get our newsletters, and we have summaries of things that you won't read in mainstream. And and if you can donate, that'd be great, because we're a very small group. We've been doing this for 22 years, and we just try to get climate science insights and energy insights to the public and policymakers so that people can make better informed decisions. And we offer all that material for free.
Yeah, listen, guys, the link is directly below this video, or if you're on a streamer, it's in the description. Please support this group of people, because, we are in a situation where I think we see the world changing in front of us. There are a lot of people who comment on it. I'm one of those people. I do commentary. I write about it, but I'm an idiot. Okay. I'm not the guy you want to be looking to for facts and information. I'm the guy that you want to read for 10 minutes, because I put words together, some people would say, in a decent way. Friends of Science, you want to be listening to these people, because Michelle and the people that she works with are on the tip of the spear of this, and they know how dangerous it really is, and where our world is going. These are the people you want to follow. Don't follow me. Follow Friends of Science and Michelle Stirling. Long story short, don't take my word for it. I am lucky enough that I get to talk to these people like Michelle. But these are the people who are on the cutting edge of this. And please, please, please go through and support. It's really easy to get caught up with culture war silliness, boys wearing dresses, and so on and so forth. But these are the real issues. And people like Justin Trudeau and the cult that he's a part of are leading towards certain destruction. And Michelle Stirling and Friends of Science are there as a bulwark against it, only if we support them. So, Michelle, I hope that that wasn't too long-winded, but that's my way of saying thank you. I appreciate everything you do. I love everything about you, and you'll always be the baddest ass lady I ever met.
Thank you so much. Thank you.